Okay, so here is the caveat, and I think probably the best way to approach this is to start with an example. So in a lot of cases, we work with organizations who have implemented Microsoft 365 and they see the value in this automation. Everything that we've spoken about, the potential for saving, increased employee satisfaction, reducing turnover as a result of less frustration from processes, all of these things they buy into. And the types of examples that, or an example of the type of workflow that could be automated, is that if you can imagine a procurement department that does bids, for instance, and they produce RFPs. The documents are go through a formal RFP process where vendors respond to them. At the end of that process, they consolidate all of the information and it goes through a set of presentations or vetting processes where there are approvals. And at the end of that, they have one or more vendors that come out as winners of that particular bid. And this is a prime workspace where automation can really assist a team like this, because in the event that documents need to move from one team to another team at certain stages of their life cycles, that is something that you can automate. Based on the state of a document, perhaps certain folks have access to it or don't have access to it. As it moves through the different stages, you need to be very careful about your aggregating vendor information. You need to keep vendor information apart from one another. And you would want to use policies and to automate the process of adding and removing members and these types of things so that you don't have a person accidentally adding a vendor to the incorrect team if you are collaborating with your vendors inside of Microsoft Teams. You can also then automate things like the integration, perhaps into something like a SAP Ariba if you're managing your procurement through that. Finally, you can then build in automated versioning of the documents. You can automate the approval workflow so that it goes out over Teams. Certain people are able to vote on it. The document is finally signed off. Then you can automate the process of having those documents executed. And finally, you can get to the end of the process where you have to do your record filing and automate the process of then moving those documents into a place where they can be turned into records, or otherwise moving them into your records management system. So, wow, lots of things that we could do to try and remove a lot of admin burden from that team. What we will find, though, is that when we start to speak to these teams about how we would go about implementing automation, that the quality of the underlying Teams governance, information governance, and clouds governance structures really feed into what is possible from an automation perspective. So, for instance, folks will say, well, we have a set of working documents and we work on them for a period of time, and then we go through an approval process. At the end of that approval process, we have a set of executed contracts or whatever the case may be. We then need to do a records filing. So during this records filing, we would like to take the executed documents and put them into a records management system. And we would like to take the working documents, and we're not going to file those as records. We're going to move them into a central location where they can be reused for content. And finally, they will then go through a disposition cycle of their own. And it's kind of separated out. And we'll hit a brick wall, because the things that we don't have is that we have a set of Word documents that are sitting inside of a folder. And it's very difficult to say, well, we can tell the difference between a Word document of one type and a Word document of another type. And really the piece that is missing is that as a precursor to this automation, there's some consideration that you have to have in terms of the platform on which you're building these automations. And that starts firstly with cloud governance, talking about roles, identities, how those fit together, policies that are built on top of that. And then finally, information governance, which is then talking about, are we able to identify the differences between different types of information? Is that related back to a taxonomy? Do we have the entire life cycle of each of our business critical documents documented? Do we have those document types mapped to record types inside of our record schedule? All of these types of things are a level of maturity that have to do with information governance. And then on top of that, we then start to talk about Teams governance, which is on top of what we've done in order to solidify our information platform. Do we now understand how workspaces are provisioned, what policies govern them, what applications are allowed in terms of a team, how the chat and the collaboration happens, at what happens at different life cycles of a team as it goes through certain phases. How is it onboarded? When is it qualified? All of these types of questions. And only when you've answered these questions can you really unlock the power of automation.
And I love this slide, by the way, Ryan, because what you're doing is you're unfurling the interesting, nuanced complexity of these different aspects, right? And as we were talking in preparation for this webinar, you know, I call this the crawl, walk, run slide, right? That sort of hierarchy of evolution, where you guys, as IT administrators and people enabling these applications to be allowed for users to get into these iterative spaces and actually build consecutively on top of each other, so that way you can actually start simply, let's have a framework here, let's have a process, let's have an idea and a responsibility component here, so that way we can start driving these business processes and then start getting into the really interesting nuances of, well, we have to comply with, you know, Sarbanes-Oxley, we have to hold on to this information for a minimum of 7 years, or this content from finance, for example, needs to be held on to in perpetuity. How do we go about giving users the easy ability to do this out of the box, locate that content for which they are responsible for, and put it into that particular bucket or location for that long-term use, like you were describing there in that records use case, right? So being able to help build that framework iteratively with all these different pieces, both within the box and out of the box solutions, so that way you guys can grow with the business and apply these needs and leverage the maximum use of all the different services and options available to you to help build that framework and process going forward.
Exactly. And I think if you look at all of the evidence that there is that supports automation as a means for making organizations more agile, more efficient, more cost effective, it's a no-brainer. And if you ask
Absolutely.
yourself the question, why is everybody not getting this right? I believe the reason is because of this, because it's
Yes.
very difficult to build automation on top of an incorrectly governed cloud platform.